The courtroom crucible, when political worlds collide. The morning light filtered through the grand windows of the Dallas courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished oak benches where spectators sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering in anticipation. The air felt charged with the unmistakable electricity that precedes high-stakes political theater, a palpable tension that seemed to pulse through the room as Judge Carter adjusted his robes and surveyed the battlefield before him. On one side sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, her posture impeccable, her demeanor projecting the confidence of someone who had navigated the treacherous waters of progressive politics to reach the halls of Congress. Her fingers tapped methodically on her legal pad as she organized her thoughts, mentally rehearsing the arguments she would soon unleash on behalf of her client, a whistleblower who had dared to challenge developer Lawson's empire. For Crockett, this wasn't merely a case, it was a manifestation of her political identity, a tangible expression of her sworn commitment to hold power accountable. All rise for the Honorable Judge Raymond Carter. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs, bringing the room to attention. As Judge Carter settled into his chair, his eyes narrowed slightly at the unexpected figure rising from the defense table. Karoline Leavitt, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, her navy suit a stark contrast against the warm wood tones of the courtroom, stood with practiced poise. The former White House press secretary, a woman who had once been the voice of conservative America, now stood as legal counsel for developer Lawson, a twist that sent ripples of surprise through the gallery. "Counselors, identify yourselves for the record," Judge Carter instructed, his tone betraying nothing of the surprise that momentarily flickered across his face. When Leavitt's name echoed through the courtroom, Crockett's head snapped up, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly. The slight falter in her composure didn't go unnoticed by the press crowded in the back row, their pens hovering expectantly over notepads. This wasn't the opponent Crockett had prepared for, this was someone whose political DNA was woven from entirely different threads than her own. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the two women locked eyes across the polished expanse that separated them. It was more than a legal confrontation. It was a collision of Americas, two visions of justice and power meeting in a forum where rhetoric alone wouldn't suffice. "Your Honor," Crockett began, her voice steady despite the churning recalibration happening behind her careful expression, "the plaintiff is prepared to demonstrate a clear pattern of corporate malfeasance that Mr. Lawson's organization has systematically attempted to conceal from public view." There was underlying music to her words, the familiar cadence of progressive indignation at corporate overreach, at systems that protected the powerful. But as she spoke, Leavitt's eyes never left her, analyzing, assessing, seeking the hairline fractures in Crockett's legal architecture with the same precision she had once used to deflect questions in the White House briefing room. When it was Leavitt's turn to speak, the subtle shift in the room's energy was impossible to miss. Her approach wasn't the bombastic style often associated with the administration she had represented, but something more refined, surgical in its precision, devastating in its methodology. The defense would like to enter into evidence documents that substantively contradict the timeline presented by the plaintiff, Leavitt stated, her voice carrying the quiet conviction of someone who knew exactly what cards she held. She slid a folder toward the bench with calculated grace. As Judge Carter reviewed the documents, Crockett's fingers ceased their tapping. The confidence that had wrapped around her like armor began to show the first signs of stress fractures. Something in Leavitt's demeanor, the slight curve at the edge of her mouth, the steadiness of her gaze, communicated that she wasn't merely prepared, she was several steps ahead. Outside the courthouse, America was watching. Conservative media outlets were already crafting storylines about Leavitt's unexpected legal acumen, while progressive platforms rallied behind Crockett, framing the confrontation as a battle between corporate impunity and accountability. In real time, the narrative was being shaped and reshaped, pixels and print coalescing around ideological fault lines that ran far deeper than this single case. Back inside, as Judge Carter called for a brief recess, Crockett gathered her papers with measured movements that belied the storm brewing within. She had underestimated Leavitt, had seen the press secretary, not the formidable legal mind that had apparently been honed away from public view. It was a miscalculation that could cost her client everything. Leavitt, meanwhile, conferred quietly with her associates, her expression betraying nothing of the strategic calculations unfolding behind her composed exterior. She had spent years absorbing blows on behalf of an administration under constant siege, had learned to weaponize underestimation, to convert perceived weakness into unexpected strength. As the gallery slowly emptied for the recess, the two women remained at their respective tables, separated by more than just the physical space between them. They were avatars of America's deepening divide, each carrying the weight of constituencies that viewed the other not merely as an opponent, but as an existential threat to their vision of justice. The battle had only just begun, but already the contours of a larger truth were emerging. In the crucible of the courtroom, as in politics, appearances could be deceiving. And Jasmine Crockett was about to learn that sometimes, the most dangerous opponents are the ones you never saw coming. What neither woman yet realized was how this courtroom confrontation would reverberate far beyond the confines of this Dallas courthouse, how it would become a flashpoint in America's ongoing struggle to define itself in an age of unprecedented polarization. As the bailiff prepared to recall the court to session, the question hanging in the air wasn't simply who would win this legal battle, but what its outcome would reveal about power, preparation, and the perilous consequences of political underestimation. The evidence gambit. Crockett's confidence meets Leavitt's legal precision. The courtroom fell to a reverent hush as Representative Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat, her shoulders squared with the confidence of someone who had battled and survived in the gladiatorial arena of American politics. The morning's proceedings had built toward this moment, her presentation of evidence that would, in her mind, finally expose developer Lawson's elaborate embezzlement scheme to the harsh light of judicial scrutiny. Crockett moved with practiced authority to the center of the courtroom, her voice resonating with the righteous certainty that had become her political trademark in progressive circles. Each document she presented was like a chess piece advanced with strategic precision, financial discrepancies highlighted in yellow, suspicious transfers outlined in red, witness testimonies corroborating patterns of financial malfeasance. Your Honor, Crockett declared, her voice carrying to the farthest corner of the chamber, what we've presented today isn't merely a collection of accounting irregularities. This is the systematic dismantling of public trust by a man who believed his position and wealth placed him beyond accountability. The gallery's collective breath hung suspended in the air. Journalist fingers hovered over keyboards, ready to translate this moment into tomorrow's headlines. For progressives watching, Crockett embodied the relentless pursuit of corporate accountability. For conservatives, she represented overreaching government interference in business affairs. The ideological divide that had fractured America was present even here, in the clinical confines of jurisprudence. Yet as Crockett concluded her presentation with a flourish that would have resonated perfectly in a congressional hearing, something shifted in the atmosphere. Karoline Leavitt, her expression betraying nothing, rose slowly from behind the defense table. "If I may, Your Honor," Leavitt began, her voice carrying the same measured control she had once used to navigate hostile press briefings in the White House. What happened next would later be described by CNN as a masterclass in legal redirection. Representative Crockett has presented what appears, on its surface, to be compelling evidence, Leavitt continued, her tone neither dismissive nor antagonistic, merely analytical. However, I'm compelled to question the admissibility of Exhibits C through F on several grounds. The subtle shift in Crockett's expression, a momentary widening of the eyes, a slight parting of the lips, did not go unnoticed by the more seasoned courtroom observers. She had anticipated objections to her arguments, her interpretations, perhaps even her standing. What she hadn't anticipated was having the very foundation of her case, the evidence itself, clinically dissected. Under United States v. Henderson and the subsequent Callahan precedent, Leavitt continued, fluidly citing case law without reference to notes, evidence obtained through the methods described in the plaintiff's own filing documents falls squarely within the exclusionary parameters established by the Eighth Circuit. Judge Carter, who had been listening with the impassive demeanor cultivated through decades on the bench, now leaned forward slightly, the judicial equivalent of raising an eyebrow. "Ms. Leavitt," he interjected, "are you suggesting that the evidence presented by Representative Crockett was obtained unlawfully?" "Not unlawfully, Your Honor," Leavitt replied, the precision of her language revealing the depth of her preparation. "I am suggesting it was obtained through methods that the Supreme Court has specifically designated as producing inadmissible evidence in similar contexts." The courtroom, moments before a stage for Crockett's prosecutorial performance, had transformed into unfamiliar territory. Whispers rippled through the gallery as legal analysts present began frantically messaging their producers. This wasn't the expected script, the former White House spokesperson demonstrating legal acumen that rivaled seasoned prosecutors was not the narrative they had prepared to cover. Crockett's hand moved to her legal pad, her fingers tracing down a page of notes that suddenly seemed insufficient. The confidence that had propelled her forward just minutes ago now competed with a creeping realization. She had made the cardinal error of underestimating her opponent based on title rather than capacity. "Your Honor, if I may respond," Crockett began, her voice carrying a new edge of defensiveness. But Leavitt was already presenting a motion to strike, complete with supporting precedent from 3 separate federal jurisdictions. The legal ballet unfolding was both unexpected and mesmerizing. Conservative media would later frame it as the moment when progressive grandstanding collided with conservative competence. As Judge Carter accepted the briefs from both attorneys, the power dynamic in the courtroom had undergone a seismic shift. Crockett, who had entered the courtroom as the congressional representative prepared to deliver justice, now found herself recalibrating her strategy against an opponent whose legal arsenal was unexpectedly formidable. In the public gallery, spectators exchanged glances laden with partisan interpretation. For supporters of the former administration, Leavitt's performance validated their belief in the competence they had always claimed existed behind the polarizing rhetoric. For Crockett supporters, this unexpected challenge was either a temporary setback or a concerning development, depending on where they fell on the spectrum of progressive optimism. What no one could deny was the tension now coiled like a spring between the two women, representatives of America's divided soul, locked in a battle that transcended the specific allegations against Lawson. As Judge Carter reviewed the motions before him, the question hanging in the climatically controlled air wasn't simply about embezzlement allegations or evidentiary procedure. It was about which vision of America, which approach to power, accountability, and justice would prevail in a nation increasingly unable to agree even on the basic rules of engagement. And as Crockett gathered her thoughts for her counter-argument, one thing became painfully clear. This court battle, like the political landscape it reflected, would not be won through passion alone. In the arena where Leavitt had unexpectedly established her dominance, expertise would determine destiny. The judge cleared his throat, ready to rule on the admissibility of evidence that could make or break Crockett's case, and perhaps her reputation as well. Legal chess, the unexpected counterattack. The air in the courtroom crackled with tension as Representative Jasmine Crockett reached the crescendo of her presentation. Her evidence against developer Lawson lay meticulously arranged before the court, each exhibit a loaded weapon in her progressive arsenal against corporate malfeasance. The gallery watched, transfixed, as she wielded her congressional authority with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention on Capitol Hill. But authority in Washington doesn't always translate to dominance in a court of law. "Your Honor, this recording clearly demonstrates the pattern of deception that Mr. Lawson has employed," Crockett declared, her voice resonating with the moral certainty that had become her signature in progressive circles. She gestured toward the evidence with the assurance of someone who believed victory was merely a formality. It was at this precise moment that Karoline Leavitt made her move. The White House press secretary, who had remained a portrait of composed silence throughout Crockett's presentation, rose from her seat with deliberate grace. Where others might have seen just another Trump administration spokesperson, a political figure rather than a legal one, Leavitt had been silently cataloging every vulnerability in Crockett's case, every procedural misstep, every evidentiary weakness. Counsel for the defense, Judge Harmon acknowledged, perhaps not expecting much from someone whose professional background was deflecting questions from the White House press corps. Leavitt nodded respectfully. "Your Honor, I'd like to address the admissibility of Representative Crockett's key evidence." Her voice carried none of the combative edge common in political discourse, only precise, measured control. Crockett's expression didn't change, but those watching closely noted her fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around her pen. This was not the challenge she had anticipated. "The recording presented by the representative," Leavitt continued, "fails to meet the chain of custody requirements established in Jacobson v. Massachusetts. Furthermore, under Federal Rule of Evidence 901, authentication has not been properly established." The gallery stirred. Legal correspondents from major networks exchanged glances. This wasn't the script they had prepared for, the former Trump spokesperson citing case law with the fluid confidence of a seasoned litigator. "Miss Leavitt," Judge Harmon leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued, "are you suggesting the recording is inadmissible?" "Not only inadmissible, Your Honor," Leavitt replied, extracting a document from her briefcase, "but potentially obtained in violation of two-party consent laws applicable in this jurisdiction." Crockett's composure, a political armor forged through countless congressional battles, momentarily fractured. The shift was subtle, a slight widening of the eyes, a barely perceptible straightening of her spine as she recalibrated her assessment of her opponent. "Your Honor, if I may respond," Crockett began, but the damage was done. The narrative had shifted. The Congresswoman who had entered the courtroom as the champion of accountability now found herself on the defensive, scrambling to protect the foundation of her case against an opponent she had grievously underestimated. In the press section, journalists were already reshaping the story in real time. Progressive outlets prepared to frame this as a procedural hiccup. Conservative media salivated at the prospect of portraying it as progressive overreach demolished by superior legal acumen. Leavitt continued her methodical dismantling, citing precedent after precedent with a precision that belied her relative youth and political background. Each citation landed with the calculated impact of artillery fire, strategically placed to expose the structural weaknesses in Crockett's case. "The Supreme Court has consistently upheld these standards," Leavitt concluded, her voice never rising, never betraying emotion, the perfect counterpoint to Crockett's passionate advocacy. "Evidence obtained under these circumstances cannot form the basis of these proceedings without fundamentally compromising their integrity." The judge nodded thoughtfully, clearly weighing the unexpected legal expertise against the political gravity of the representative before him. The courtroom had become a microcosm of America's ideological battleground, progressive certitude colliding with conservative competence in a zero-sum game where only one vision could prevail. Crockett, recovering her composure, gathered her notes with the practiced poise of a politician accustomed to adapting under pressure. But the gallery had already witnessed the momentary flinch, the flash of recognition that she had committed the cardinal political sin, underestimating an opponent based on title rather than capability. Outside the courthouse, partisan crowds gathered under a sky heavy with approaching rain, their divided loyalties mirroring the fractured political landscape. News vans lined the street, satellite dishes tilted skyward, the media machinery primed to broadcast this showdown as yet another battle in America's unending culture war. Inside, Crockett rose again, prepared to counter Leavitt's legal offensive. But as she faced the court, the dynamics had irrevocably shifted. No longer was this merely about developer Lawson's alleged financial improprieties. It had transformed into a test of competing approaches to power, the passionate progressive congresswoman versus the surprisingly formidable conservative press secretary. Leavitt's unexpected display of legal prowess had transformed what should have been a straightforward hearing into a high-stakes chess match where the next move could determine not just the fate of this case, but potentially the narrative arc of both women's political futures. As Judge Harmon prepared to rule on the admissibility of the contested recording, the tension in the room crystallized around a question no one had anticipated at the day's beginning. In the battleground of American justice, which would prove more powerful, congressional authority or constitutional expertise? The next moments would reveal whether Crockett could recover from this unexpected counterattack, or whether Leavitt's legal ambush had already decided the outcome before the final gavel fell. The unexpected legal assassin. The oak-paneled courtroom, usually a sanctuary of procedural decorum, had transformed into an arena of raw political theater. Representative Jasmine Crockett, standing before the bench with confidence born from countless congressional hearings, was about to discover that Washington's hierarchies held little currency in the unforgiving landscape of judicial combat. As Judge Harmon's gavel struck, signaling the continuation of proceedings, the tension crystallized around a fundamental collision of worldviews. The progressive congresswoman versus the conservative press secretary, a matchup that, on paper, seemed almost comically mismatched. "Representative Crockett," the judge intoned. "You may continue." Crockett nodded, a subtle smile at the corners of her mouth suggesting the comfortable certainty of someone accustomed to controlling narratives. "Your Honor, the evidence clearly establishes a pattern of willful disregard for regulatory standards." Her voice carried the weight of moral authority, honed through years of advocating for communities she believed the system had failed. From her position at the defense table, White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt observed with calculating precision. Where the gallery saw just another Trump administration spokesperson, someone whose job was deflecting questions rather than dissecting legal arguments, lurked a strategic mind meticulously mapping every vulnerability in Crockett's presentation. Leavitt's moment arrived with surgical timing. "Objection, Your Honor." The press secretary's voice cut through the courtroom, with unexpected authority, devoid of political flourish. The representative's evidence fails to meet the evidentiary threshold established in Morales v. Westbrook. Crockett's rhythm faltered, imperceptible to most, but a seismic shift to the political journalists whose livelihoods depended on reading such micro-expressions. The Congresswoman's eyes narrowed slightly, recalibrating her assessment of the woman she had dismissed as merely a political appointee. Furthermore, Leavitt continued, effortlessly citing 3 additional precedents that question the admissibility of Crockett's central evidence. The Supreme Court has consistently maintained that evidence obtained through the methods described in the representative's own filing cannot stand without violating the very constitutional principles she claims to defend. The courtroom collectively inhaled. This wasn't in anyone's predicted script. Judge Harmon removed his glasses, a gesture that veterans of his courtroom recognized as a signal of genuine interest. Ms. Leavitt, are you suggesting the foundational evidence in the representative's case is constitutionally compromised? Not suggesting, Your Honor. Demonstrating. Leavitt produced a bound legal brief that hadn't been visible moments before. We've prepared a comprehensive analysis of the jurisdictional and constitutional barriers that render the representative's evidence not merely inadmissible, but potentially sanctionable. Crockett's composure, that essential armor of any effective politician, visibly recalibrated. The shift registered in real time on social media, as courtroom observers transmitted the unexpected narrative twist to a polarized audience hungry for political bloodsport. Your Honor! Crockett's voice found its footing again, though now carrying a defensive edge that hadn't been present minutes earlier. Ms. Leavitt's objections represent a fundamental misreading of both the case law and the evidence collection protocols we followed meticulously. But the damage was done. The narrative had irrevocably shifted. What the progressive base had anticipated as a triumphant confrontation had mutated into something far more complex, a legal chess match against an opponent who had concealed her most devastating moves until the critical moment. In the press gallery, the machinery of partisan media began reframing the encounter. Conservative outlets highlighted Leavitt's unexpected legal precision. Progressive platforms emphasized Crockett's unwavering commitment to accountability despite procedural roadblocks. The representative's passion is commendable, Leavitt responded, her tone maintaining the perfect calibration between respect and devastating critique. But passion cannot override established constitutional safeguards, no matter how worthy the cause. Crockett felt the ground shifting beneath her. Each citation from Leavitt carried the weight of someone who had spent nights studying case law, rather than preparing press briefings. The White House spokesperson was revealing layers of expertise that transcended her public persona, transforming before the court from political appointee to constitutional scholar. Outside, rain began to fall on the assembled crowds, the weather mirroring the dampening of progressive expectations. Inside, under the unforgiving fluorescent lights, Crockett faced a choice that would define more than this case: whether to retreat into defensive posturing or acknowledge the unexpected caliber of her opponent and adapt accordingly. Your Honor! Crockett straightened her shoulders, gathering herself for the counteroffensive. If I may respond to Ms. Leavitt's objections point by point. The judge nodded, but his expression had altered subtly. The deference initially granted to the Congresswoman's position had evolved into something more evaluative, the look of someone reassessing all previous assumptions. As Crockett began her response, the stakes extended far beyond the immediate legal question. This had become a battle over who possessed the true authority to interpret America's founding principles, which vision would shape the justice system's future, and which woman would emerge with her political capital enhanced rather than diminished. In Washington's corridors of power, phones began lighting up as staffers transmitted the unfolding drama to their principals. The confrontation was transcending its immediate context, becoming something more symbolic, a microcosm of America's ideological warfare playing out in real time, with unexpected warriors revealing capabilities that would reshape the political battlefield long after Judge Harmon's final ruling. The question hanging in the air, unspoken but unavoidable, was whether Representative Crockett could recover from this ambush, or if Karoline Leavitt had already accomplished what countless press briefings never could, establishing herself not merely as a messenger for power, but as a formidable wielder of it in her own right. The unraveling. Crockett's collapse under Leavitt's legal virtuosity. The marble columns and polished oak of the federal courthouse had witnessed countless legal battles, but few as laden with political subtext as the one unfolding this afternoon. Representative Jasmine Crockett's earlier confidence, a fortress built on progressive credentials and congressional authority, was beginning to fracture under the relentless precision of Karoline Leavitt's legal counteroffensive. What had begun as Crockett's calculated offensive against the administration was transforming into an unexpected war of attrition, Each passing hour revealed a disturbing truth for the progressive champion. The White House press secretary was not merely reciting talking points, but dismantling Crockett's legal framework with the surgical precision of a constitutional scholar. Counsel's interpretation of Section 1983 has been explicitly rejected by the Seventh Circuit, Leavitt stated, her voice carrying none of the defensive posturing typically associated with press briefings. Instead, her tone reflected the dispassionate authority of someone who had spent years in law review, not communication strategy. The representative's entire premise rests on a reading that the Supreme Court categorically dismissed in both Heller v. Davis and the more recent Westmoreland decision. For those observing closely, the shift in the courtroom's power dynamics registered in micro-expressions: Crockett's momentary hesitation before responding, the slight tightening around her eyes. The Congresswoman, known for her commanding presence in committee hearings, found herself increasingly reactive rather than proactive. "If I may redirect the court's attention," Crockett countered, her voice rising slightly above its usual measured cadence. "Ms. Leavitt's citations deliberately ignore the contextual applications outlined in Justice Kagan's concurrence." But Judge Harmon was already leaning forward, his interest visibly piqued by Leavitt's argument. "I'm familiar with Justice Kagan's opinion, Representative. But Ms. Leavitt raises substantive questions about jurisdiction that require addressing." Outside the courtroom, America's polarized media landscape was already reframing the confrontation through competing ideological lenses. Conservative outlets celebrated what they termed Leavitt's masterclass in constitutional law, while progressive platforms emphasized judicial technicalities threatening accountability. What none could deny was the palpable shift in momentum. The anticipated narrative, a fearless Congresswoman holding power to account, was being rewritten in real time. In its place emerged something far more complex: a battle between two formidable women, representing America's deepening ideological divide, with the Constitution itself as contested territory. "Your Honor," Crockett said, frustration finally bleeding through her professional veneer, "the defense is deliberately obscuring the material facts with procedural smokescreens." Leavitt's response came with the calm certainty of someone who had anticipated every possible objection. The procedures Representative Crockett dismisses so casually are the very safeguards that protect our democratic system from the political passions of the moment. Crockett's team, seated behind her, exchanged glances laden with growing concern. The legal brief they had prepared, meticulously crafted to showcase their principal's righteous case against the administration, now seemed inadequate against Leavitt's unexpected legal virtuosity. "Perhaps," Judge Harmon suggested, "the representative would like to address Ms. Leavitt's citation of Thompson v. Northeast Regional regarding the inadmissibility of the evidence in question." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but broadcast volumes to the attentive gallery. Within that pause lived the realization that Crockett, like so many before her, had fundamentally underestimated Karoline Leavitt, seeing only the press secretary role and missing the legal mind behind it. "We'll need time to review that particular precedent, Your Honor," Crockett finally acknowledged, her words carefully measured to conceal their implicit concession. The political implications reverberated beyond the courtroom walls. In congressional offices, staffers monitored the proceedings with mounting alarm. What was supposed to be a showcase of progressive accountability was instead becoming a cautionary tale about presumption. Crockett's hands gripped the podium tighter, her knuckles whitening almost imperceptibly. Her next words emerged with the deliberate control of someone working to contain mounting frustration. "The defense counsel's selective reading of precedent cannot—" "Objection," Leavitt interjected calmly. "Characterizing my citations as selective when the representative seems unfamiliar with Thompson is precisely the kind of rhetoric that has no place in these proceedings." Judge Harmon's gavel fell not forcefully but with finality. "Sustained." That single word, sustained, landed like a thunderclap in the progressive corners of social media. The narrative was shifting irrevocably. The administration that Crockett's supporters had dismissed as legally unsophisticated was now outmaneuvering one of Congress's most outspoken members on her own terms. What few in the gallery could see was the calculation behind Leavitt's composed exterior. This wasn't merely legal combat, it was a strategic redefinition of her public persona. Each citation, each measured response, was building something beyond this case, political capital that transcended her role as spokesperson. As the afternoon session approached its conclusion, the question hanging in the politically charged air was no longer whether Crockett could score a decisive victory, but whether she could salvage enough footing to prevent a complete collapse of her position. The progressive champion found herself in unfamiliar territory, defending rather than attacking, reacting rather than leading. And across the courtroom, Karoline Leavitt maintained the composed demeanor of someone who had prepared for precisely this moment, when preparation would trump position, and expertise would challenge assumption. The battle lines of American politics were being redrawn in real time, not through the familiar theater of press conferences and Twitter pronouncements, but in the methodical application of constitutional principle. The judge glanced at the clock. "We'll recess until tomorrow morning." His words offered Crockett a reprieve but not escape. The overnight hours would determine whether she could regroup and counter Leavitt's unexpected legal arsenal, or whether this courtroom would become the site of a political reckoning that neither woman could have fully anticipated when the day began. The legal chessboard, Leavitt's precedents, shift the judicial tides. The atmosphere in courtroom 317 thickened as Karoline Leavitt methodically arranged a series of leather-bound volumes on her counsel table. What had begun as Representative Crockett's calculated offensive was now entering its most critical phase, a legal chess match where each citation functioned as both shield and sword. The gallery fell silent as Leavitt rose, her demeanor betraying nothing of her internal strategy. "Your Honor, if I may direct the court's attention to Harrington v. California, where Justice Marshall established that the threshold for claims of this nature requires demonstration of concrete and particularized injury, a standard the representative has failed to meet." Judge Harmon's eyes narrowed with interest. The Reagan appointee had maintained studied neutrality throughout the proceedings, but legal scholars in attendance noted his subtle lean forward, the judicial equivalent of raising an eyebrow. "Furthermore," Leavitt continued, her voice gaining not in volume but in gravitas, "the Ninth Circuit's ruling in Edwards specifically addressed the separation of powers concerns at play here. I've provided the court with the relevant portions highlighted on page 17. The judge scanned the document, his expression shifting imperceptibly. "This is persuasive, Ms. Leavitt," he acknowledged, the first clear indication of his leanings since the hearing began. Across the courtroom, Representative Crockett's legal team exchanged glances laden with unspoken concern. Their principal, however, maintained the composed exterior that had defined her rise through Democratic ranks. Only the tightening of her jaw betrayed the recognition that the legal ground was shifting beneath her feet. "Your Honor," Crockett interjected, rising swiftly, "Edwards was decided in a substantively different political context." "The court should consider." "Representative," Judge Harmon interrupted, "context may inform our understanding of precedent, but it doesn't negate it." Ms. Leavitt's citation of Brenner v. Department of Justice also appears directly applicable to your standing argument. In the press gallery, journalists' fingers flew across keyboards. The predicted narrative of a congressional champion cornering an administration spokesperson was dissolving in real time. In its place emerged a far more nuanced story of legal expertise transcending political expectations. On cable news split screens across America, commentators were already reframing the confrontation. "What we're witnessing," noted constitutional scholar Eliza Montgomery on CNN, "is the danger of underestimating adversaries based on their public roles." Leavitt may be the administration's voice, but she's demonstrating the mind of someone intimately familiar with complex constitutional theory. Fox News, meanwhile, seized a different angle. "Representative Crockett came armed for a political showdown but found herself in a legal seminar instead," remarked anchor William Hayes with barely concealed satisfaction. In the courtroom, Leavitt continued her methodical dismantling of Crockett's core arguments. The Supreme Court's guidance in Holloway explicitly cautions against congressional overreach in matters where executive privilege has constitutional foundation. Justice Alito's majority opinion states, and I quote, "The separation of powers framework cannot be subordinated to political expediency, regardless of how compelling the moment's passions may appear." Crockett's legal advisor whispered urgently in her ear, passing her a hastily annotated brief. The representative nodded, her expression hardening as she recognized the tactical error in her team's preparation. They had prepared for Leavitt, the press secretary, not Leavitt, the constitutional strategist. "Ms. Leavitt raises interesting points," Judge Harmon observed, "that seem to challenge the jurisdictional foundation of your complaint, Representative. Do you have response to her citation of Holloway?" The momentary hesitation before Crockett's response registered with every political operative in the room. In Washington's power ecosystem, such microseconds of uncertainty were blood in the water. "We maintain that Holloway's application is limited by the subsequent findings in United States v. Nixon," Crockett countered, but her customary authoritative tone had acquired a defensive edge that seasoned courtroom observers immediately detected. Leavitt allowed herself no visible reaction to this apparent advantage, no triumphant smile, no knowing glance toward her team. Instead, she presented the disciplined focus of someone who understood that in high-stakes legal confrontations, emotional restraint was itself a form of power. "The representative's invocation of Nixon actually strengthens our position," Leavitt responded, her voice modulated to project reasoned analysis rather than partisan victory. "Nixon established boundaries on executive privilege, but explicitly preserved its core constitutional function. Precisely the principle we're defending today." Judge Harmon nodded, the judicial equivalent of a chess player acknowledging a particularly elegant move. "I find Ms. Leavitt's reading of Nixon compelling," he stated, words that sent tremors through progressive Twitter and text chains across Capitol Hill. From the public gallery, the ideological divide in American politics was physically manifest. Conservatives leaning forward in anticipation, progressives shifting uncomfortably as the legal momentum visibly transferred to the administration's representative. As the afternoon session approached its conclusion, the narrative had fundamentally transformed. What progressive strategists had envisioned as Crockett's star moment, holding power to account through force of legal argument, had instead become a masterclass in preparation and precise constitutional application from an unexpected source. Crockett gathered her notes, her movements deliberate, controlled. The consummate politician, she revealed nothing of the recalibration occurring behind her composed facade. Tomorrow would require a complete strategic reset, not just in legal argument but in fundamental approach. As the courtroom began to empty, network correspondents delivered hushed stand-ups from the corridor. "The White House appears to have deployed not just a spokesperson but a constitutional scholar," reported NBC's Diane Chen. "The question now becomes whether Representative Crockett can adapt to this unexpected reality before the judge renders what increasingly appears to be a ruling that could fundamentally reshape the balance of power between Congress and the executive branch." Leavitt departed through a side door, declining the cluster of microphones awaiting comment. Her silence spoke volumes. This was no longer about winning the day's news cycle. This was about establishing legal precedent that would long outlast any press conference soundbite. The judge's gavel had fallen, but the seismic implications of the day's proceedings were just beginning to register across Washington's intricate power landscape. For Crockett, the night ahead promised little sleep and intense strategy sessions. For Leavitt, it offered validation that preparation could trump position, that assumptions about capability based on political role were often the first casualty in high-stakes confrontations. And for a polarized nation watching through their partisan filters, the day's events reinforced a fundamental truth about American politics, that battles often turn not on ideology alone, but on the unexpected mastery of the institutional frameworks within which those ideological contests unfold. The scales of power, Judge Carter's moment of decision. The oak-paneled courtroom fell into a suffocating silence as Judge Carter leaned forward at the bench, his weathered fingers interlaced before him. The moment hung suspended in the charged air, a pivotal inflection point where legal precedent, political ambition, and constitutional principles converged into a single judicial declaration. "I will review the evidence presented by both parties," he announced, his baritone voice carrying the weight of decades on the federal bench. "This matter requires careful consideration of not just the facts at hand, but their implications for the separation of powers that forms the backbone of our republic." Across the courtroom, Representative Jasmine Crockett's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. The progressive firebrand who had built her reputation challenging institutional power now found herself at the mercy of it. Her eyes, typically alight with righteous conviction, reflected a more complex calculus, the recognition that judicial temperament might trump progressive momentum. Her legal team exchanged glances, laden with unspoken concern, their collective political capital now invested in a ruling beyond their control. Opposite her, White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt maintained the disciplined composure that had surprised observers throughout the proceedings. The woman known for parrying press corps questions with unwavering loyalty to the administration had revealed herself as something more formidable, a legal strategist who understood the architecture of constitutional boundaries. Only the slight tapping of her index finger against the counsel table betrayed the adrenaline coursing beneath her poised exterior. Between them, the evidence, documents, testimonies, precedents, and counter-precedents represented far more than procedural artifacts. They embodied the very fault lines of American democracy in an era of unprecedented polarization, where progressive calls for accountability clashed with conservative defenses of executive authority. In the gallery, journalists hunched forward, their partisan affiliations determining which narrative they were already constructing. Either a courageous congresswoman holding power to account, or an overreaching legislative branch intruding upon executive prerogative. The ideological divide that had fractured American discourse was physically manifest in their segregated seating, left-leaning outlets clustered together, conservative media forming their own defensive perimeter. The court recognizes the significance of this matter, Judge Carter continued, his gaze sweeping across the chamber. The balance between congressional oversight and executive privilege is not merely a legal abstraction but a fundamental mechanism of our constitutional design. Outside the courthouse, competing demonstrations had formed, progressive activists waving handmade signs demanding transparency, conservative supporters defending presidential authority with equally passionate displays. The scene mirrored the national division that had transformed routine constitutional questions into existential battles for America's soul. For Crockett, the stakes extended beyond the immediate legal question. As a rising star in progressive politics, her confrontation with Leavitt had become symbolic of a broader resistance, a test case for whether traditional oversight tools could still function in an era where partisan loyalty often trumped institutional obligation. Her political future now pivoted on judicial interpretation. Leavitt, meanwhile, carried the administration's confidence, entrusted with defending not just a policy position but a philosophical approach to governance. The former campaign spokesperson turned press secretary had been dismissed by opponents as merely a loyal messenger. That miscalculation had led to this moment, where her unexpected legal acumen had shifted the courtroom's center of gravity. "I will issue my ruling next week," Judge Carter concluded, the gentle tap of his gavel resonating through the chamber like a seismic warning. "Court is adjourned." As the assemblage rose in unison, the physical proximity of adversaries in the narrow corridor outside only heightened the psychological distance between their worldviews. No handshakes were exchanged, no professional courtesies offered. The partisan chasm had grown too wide for such traditions. Crockett moved toward waiting microphones, her stride purposeful despite the uncertainty ahead. "Justice sometimes requires patience," she told gathered reporters, "but the American people deserve answers, and we remain confident that the rule of law will prevail." Leavitt chose a different exit, avoiding the media gauntlet entirely, a strategic silence that allowed the administration to control its message, while leaving opponents to fill the void with speculation. It was the discipline of someone who understood that in Washington's ecosystem, periods between decisions often determined their ultimate impact. As darkness fell over the Capitol, lights burned late in offices across the city. In the White House counsel's office, legal strategies were refined. On Capitol Hill, progressive coalitions debated contingencies. The week ahead promised either vindication or recalibration for both sides. But for tonight, the Capitol held its collective breath, awaiting a judicial determination that would either reinforce or redraw the boundaries between America's competing powers, a ruling that would inevitably be celebrated by half the nation and denounced by the other, regardless of its legal reasoning. In Judge Carter's chambers, evidence files lay open on his desk, the weight of constitutional interpretation settling upon his shoulders. Whatever his decision, it would soon become another battle line in America's intensifying cold civil war, a war fought not with weapons, but with precedents, procedures, and the power of competing narratives about what American democracy should be. The aftermath, when legal brilliance upends political calculus. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4A swung closed with finality as Judge Carter's chambers absorbed him into their sanctum of judicial contemplation. Left in his wake was a battlefield of legal strategy, now momentarily suspended in the liminal space of recess. What remained was the psychological aftermath of an unexpected reckoning. Representative Jasmine Crockett stood motionless at the prosecution table, her fingertips pressed against mahogany in a gesture that resembled both support and restraint. The progressive firebrand who had entered these proceedings with the righteous momentum of public accountability now found herself wrestling with the disorienting sensation of miscalculation. Her legal team surrounded her in a protective formation, their hushed voices carrying the urgent cadence of strategic recalibration. "We underestimated her," one aide whispered, glancing across the emptying chamber toward their opponent. Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, whose legal acumen had blindsided the congressional team, gathered her documents with methodical precision. The Trump administration's chosen defender had been dismissed by the Washington establishment as merely a messenger, a spokeswoman selected for loyalty rather than legal sophistication. That prejudgment had now collapsed under the weight of her performance, revealing layers of strategic intelligence that the progressive vanguard had failed to anticipate. "She's not just repeating talking points," a veteran court reporter murmured to his colleague as they watched Leavitt confer with her team. "She's navigating constitutional precedent like someone who spent years preparing for this exact confrontation." Outside the courthouse, dueling narratives were already solidifying in America's fractured media ecosystem. Conservative outlets framed the proceedings as an ambush reversed, the establishment's attempt to humiliate an administration spokesperson transformed into a showcase for conservative legal intellect. Progressive channels emphasized procedural technicalities, attempting to reframe Leavitt's effectiveness as mere obstruction rather than substantive legal reasoning. But within the marble walls of the courthouse, away from cameras and microphones, the reality was unvarnished. Crockett's ambitious move to confront the administration directly had encountered not the expected resistance of political deflection, but the formidable barrier of constitutional expertise. "Representative Crockett," called a voice from the doorway. An aide approached with a tablet displaying real-time headlines. The Congresswoman's eyes narrowed as she absorbed the emerging narrative, one that was rapidly casting Leavitt as a hidden legal prodigy and herself as unprepared. "They're already calling her the administration's secret weapon," the aide continued, scrolling through coverage that painted Leavitt's performance in increasingly admiring tones. Crockett's shoulders squared, her jaw setting with renewed determination. The daughter of a union organizer who had fought her way through law school and into Congress, she was no stranger to setbacks recast as strategic pauses. "Then we adapt," she replied, her voice carrying the measured control of someone accustomed to the cameras that would soon await her statement. Across the room, Leavitt maintained her composed exterior, but those closest to her recognized the subtle tells of satisfaction, the slight upward curve at the corner of her mouth, the deliberate care with which she organized her legal references. The former campaign strategist understood that courtroom victories were measured not just in judicial rulings, but in perception management. Today, she had altered her public image from loyal spokesperson to constitutional defender. In the gallery, political operatives from both parties were already transmitting battlefield assessments back to their respective headquarters. The confrontation had transcended its immediate legal questions to become a symbolic proxy war in America's ideological cold conflict, a test case for whether progressive oversight could penetrate the armor of executive privilege when defended by unexpected competence. "This changes the calculus," texted one Democratic strategist to party leadership. "We need to reassess the entire approach." As the recess continued, the adjacent conference rooms became staging grounds for the battle's next phase. In one, Crockett's team huddled around precedents that might counterbalance Leavitt's arguments. In another, the press secretary received congratulatory messages from administration officials who had witnessed her transformation from communications specialist to legal combatant. Between them lay not just legal arguments, but competing visions of American governance, progressive demands for transparency clashing against conservative defenses of executive authority. The polarized lenses through which each side viewed constitutional principles had turned routine oversight into existential conflict. As the bailiff announced the court's imminent return to session, both women gathered themselves for the confrontation's continuation. Crockett straightened her jacket, armor for the cameras that would dissect her every reaction. Leavitt reviewed her notes one final time, aware that maintaining momentum would prove more challenging than creating it. The heavy doors reopened, admitting Judge Carter back to his bench. His expression revealed nothing of his evolving assessment, his judicial temperament, an impenetrable shield against the partisan passions swirling before him. "Court is now in session," he announced, his gavel's echo resounding through the chamber like a starting pistol for the next round of constitutional combat. As both women rose in unison, the fundamental question hanging in the air had shifted. What had begun as Crockett's offensive against the administration's transparency now included an unexpected dimension. Could progressive political momentum withstand the surprising revelation of conservative legal expertise? The answer would reshape not just these proceedings but the strategic landscape of accountability battles yet to come. And in the tense silence that followed, as Leavitt prepared to continue her defense, the weight of this new reality settled across the courtroom. The administration had revealed its hidden strength, and the progressive vanguard now faced a choice between adaptation and defeat in a confrontation that would define both women's political futures.